Okay. Well, it's been a weird day, but this is the last part of the narrated um, portion of our makeup, and then we will get together for a makeup session and have a kind of a broad general discussion about Gurevitch's work, about Rwanda, the genocide, and perhaps something that's um, just become a news event as of yesterday that kind of near and dear to my heart that I'll reference at the very end in a kind of personal way. I hope you'll forgive that. So just yeah, let's just get to this. So it's pretty clear that Rwanda, the genocide, gives rise, I think, to one of the most vexing questions for students of international society. You don't have to be a committed interventionist. You don't have to be any kind of um, come from any particular school of international relations theory, I think, to find um, this a pretty compelling case and a pretty compelling question to which it gives rise. And that is, when confronted, as we were so plainly with what Gurevitch refers to as the most unambiguous case of genocide since Hitler's war against the Jews, we're left to ask, I think, what explains why international society and most especially its leading power, the United States, adopted the bystander posture. There's a lot packed in there. There are clearly myriad alternative explanations for this. I'm going to do my best to give you one that I think or kind of explore this question in a way that I think is reasonable and fair. But I think first we just want to kind of recall John Roth's discussion of the very problematic nature of the very concept of bystander as it fits within this common structure or taxonomy in not just mass atrocities actually, but in say criminology, but certainly it's ever present in the study of genocide and mass atrocity crimes, and that's the perpetrator, victim, bystander taxonomy. And as you can see on this representation, this graphical representation, that they really do sort of seek to, or the taxonomy purports to kind of capture the range of possible modalities or roles that one can identify in the context of mass atrocity crimes. There are those who think that's not the case and add other roles to it, and that's not inconsistent with what John has to say about the particular element of this taxonomy, and that is the bystander. So we've got pretty clear definitions or pretty straightforward clarity on, I think, the perpetrator and the victim elements of the taxonomy, right? I mean, the intentions and actions of perpetrators, right, entail victims, right? So it's fair to say, right, that perpetrators seek victims or have targeted victims in mind, and victims obviously do not exist without the perpetrators of the mass atrocity crime. So again, kind of the two ends of this spectrum have, a fair degree of clarity, I think, for most people. Even if we would admit that, say, a perpetrator of a mass atrocity crime is itself a category that's pretty broad. I mean, is it a principal génocidaire? Has it turned out my dear friend from France, Anani Nkurunziza, turned out to be? Or, in the case of Rwanda, is it one of the perhaps close to 300,000 participants in mass murder. So the categories themselves, perhaps intrinsically, are broad and can contain a range of actions and actors. Perhaps that's a little less true of victim. I mean, one recognizes victimhood in degrees, but ultimately, if we're talking about mass atrocity crimes, it's the singular assault in violation of one's human dignity and usually their death. It is this middle category, pardon me, the bystander that is troubling for a lot of people. What does it mean to be a bystander to genocide? And I give this this image. I've chosen this image for all kinds of reasons. This is the article. If you can't, it's probably quite small, but you might not be able to make it. But the author of that article from the Atlantic magazine, "Bystander to Genocide," which became a chapter in her Pulitzer Prize-winning book, is Samantha Power, who published this would-be chapter from her book called "A Problem from Hell." And it's a scathing attack, criticism on the Clinton administration and on, to a lesser degree, on the United Nations for its failure to act with any apparent concern for the well-being of the nearly 1 million Tutsis and the moderate Hutus that also lost their lives. And this propelled Samantha Power. This brought her to national attention. She hadn't really published anything. And it brought her to the attention, in fact, of then Illinois Democratic Senator Barack Obama, who was so impressed by the book that she ended up publishing, which was, as I say, A Problem from Hell, which is about a host of genocide or mass atrocity events and the basic kind of collective failure that commonly attended those events, the collective failure to act in any meaningful way. Barack Obama actually invited, and she accepted his invitation to join his senatorial staff as a foreign policy advisor. And then when he ascended to the White House, he brought her along, of course, and eventually, in the second term, she became the United States permanent representative to the United Nations. So it was quite a trajectory, and it was really everything to do with her focus on mass atrocity crimes. But that doesn't, in fact, one could say, we might bring this up in our makeup session. A lot of people, including me, criticize her performance. Her first job in the White House was actually to head the newly created office within the R2P Responsibility to Protect context. It's called R2P calls for states across the world to create these institutions within their government that will act as kind of research and early warning offices with respect to mass atrocity crimes. And she was named to head that new, kind of create and lead that agency within the White House. However, it was on her watch that many criticized, not always fairly, I think, but many criticized the United States' failure to intervene more effectively and more with more vigor in the Syrian conflict. And many say that she was not at all the person who wrote that Pulitzer Prize-winning book that had such clear, or I should say, had such obvious moral clarity that is characteristic of one who doesn't hold office. And I've said to you guys, I think, that I try to remember that I have a very luxurious job, and that is to critique and the times that I've been in a decision-making position, I've felt the weight. So, at any rate, so what of this middle category, right? John Roth tells us that, I think, in a very, very interesting way, right, that bystanders are more than just some kind of derivative extra person category in this taxonomy. He really sees them as absolutely essential to understanding mass atrocity events. He says, and this is a quote, that the power of perpetrators and the vulnerability of their victims both depend on bystanders. And I just want us to kind of think about that for a second, right? I mean, the power of perpetrators, the ability of perpetrators to effectively pursue their genocidal aims depends on the presence of bystanders. As well, the vulnerability of victims, the exposure of victims to the designs of perpetrators also depends on the presence of bystanders. So whatever they are, and we kind of haven't really said what they are yet, but whatever they are, from this perspective, we can see the centrality of this category of bystanders. But it's also one of the things that John criticizes the category for, because it really does admit of so many possible modes of inaction and action that it becomes something of a problematic category. So what does the construct of bystander actually entail? What does it mean when Samantha Power accused the Clinton administration of having been a bystander to the Rwandan genocide, or when I would do so, or many, as well as the United Nations, the Department of Peacekeeping Operations? What does it mean to say conceptually that something, some agency, some person is a bystander? Well, I think the first thing that is important to appreciate is that perhaps contrary to what we might presume from the term itself, it is not merely, or perhaps even mainly, about passivity, right? And that's, I think, consistent with what John has to say, that if you see the significance of bystanding to both the perpetrator's power and the vulnerability of victims, it instantly invites some imagination of a great deal of agency, perhaps, among bystanders. And that's absolutely the case that we want to identify with the Clinton administration. To say that the Clinton administration was a bystander to the Rwandan genocide should not in any way lead you to conclude that it simply didn't do anything. The real stain, for those of you that remember the basis for his impeachment, the real stain on the Clinton administration is not on that infamous blue dress. It is in the blood of nearly 1 million victims of Hutu madness. So to proceed, I think perhaps we should recall Peter Singer back into this discussion, and really only, we don't need any more of Singer's argument than just that very first element that seemingly no one has any problem with. As we move through Peter Singer's argument, there are grounds for some to call things into question, but almost no one, certainly no one I've ever taught or had any in-depth discussion about Singer, takes any issue with his first predicating assumption, which, if you remember, is, he says, I begin with the assumption that suffering and death from lack of food, shelter, and medical care are bad. And he goes on to say, I'm just not going to argue for that, right? If you don't subscribe to that basic proposition, then, we live in just fundamentally different moral universes, and we've just got nothing further to discuss. And as I say, in the years that the many years I've been teaching this stuff, No one has ever had any issue with that first predicating assumption. As we move deeper into his argument, people start to raise questions and issues, but no one takes this one, or no one takes any issue with this one. So that's interesting, because if we accept Singer's predicating assumption, and my point is, I've not met to date anyone who does not, and if John is correct that perpetrators need bystanders in order to effectively carry out their genocidal intentions, and the bystander contributes independently a great deal to the vulnerability of victims to the perpetrators, then this raises an interesting point that John proposes. No person, and you can kind of hear the sort of idiom or idiomatic language of Singer here. No person, then, ought to be a perpetrator, a victim, or a bystander when the intentions and actions of perpetrators victimize others. I hope you can kind of hear Singer in that view of John, right? If we accept Singer's premise that needless human suffering, preventable needless human suffering is a bad thing, we appreciate that bystanding has an independent contribution to mass atrocity crimes, then I think John is fair to conclude that morally no person should be a perpetrator, a victim, or a bystander. And yet, Rwanda makes so clear that we reneged once again on our promise of never again that we made in the wake of the Holocaust. So the question is why? On what grounds can we try to make sense of this really colossal failure of will on the part of the United States, the Clinton administration, but the international society quite largely in its institutions in the United Nations, the Secretariat, the Security Council, the Department of Peacekeeping Operations. There's lots of failure lots of blame to apportion. So why, right? Why did we fail Rwanda? Why did we fail the Tutsis in their hour of such desperate need? I think it's really critically important to appreciate that Rwanda took place fundamentally in the shadow of an event of momentous importance to Americans and to President Clinton in particular. So I'm here to argue that the origins of American bystanding in the face, and UN as well actually, but the origins of American bystanding in the face of genocide in Rwanda actually lie 1,000 miles to the east of Kigali and 6 months into the previous past. And what I'm referring to, perhaps you've already figured that out, is when what started out as a much celebrated and what is often forgotten actually was quite a successful humanitarian intervention in most respects, and particularly with respect to the fundamental objective of Operation Restore Hope, which was to prevent the starvation, the death of some 250,000 to 400,000 Somalis from conflict-induced famine. The intervention ordered by George Herbert Walker Bush was a noble venture, in my view, and we can talk about that if there's interest. I think it's probably pretty obvious that I'm kind of on the liberal side of things, but I have, after much thinking, I've taught foreign policy for many years now, and I've come to the conclusion actually that I think George Herbert Walker, and domestically he did some things that I just couldn't stand, but I have to give George Herbert Walker Bush, not his son, but the first President Bush, I actually suggest he might deserve the mantle of having been the most successful, the most important foreign policy president, certainly in the post-Cold War era, but possibly in the war era, the post-World War II era, which puts him right up there with Truman. And so I'm saying a lot when I say that that the first President Bush, certainly deserves our respect, and I think he did the right thing, and he did the we could talk a bit more about kind of his oh hell let's just do the right thing attitude, but we all know that what started out with good intentions ended disastrously under the Clinton administration. George Bush thought that the mission would be over and done by the time because one of the things about Bush that's notable is that he authorized this intervention without any personal gain to be had. He had already lost the election for for re-election. He was going to be a one-term president, so there was no bump in the polls to be had for sending troops into conflict. Somalia was no longer, during the Cold War it had been, but Somalia was of no geostrategic value to the United States anymore. It really was, I think, and some people question, whether you can ever have a truly humanitarian motive for an intervention, and I think if there has been one, I think this is it, and Bush deserves the credit for that. It went south, however, and it did not. The boys did not come home by Christmas, and things went very, very badly, as we know, in the Battle of Mogadishu. During our discussion, I'd be happy to give you some background that 99% of Americans, or perhaps worldwide, don't really appreciate, as to why. Because when Americans saw this image that the Rangers were attacked in the capital of Somalia, and 18 of them lost their lives, and the brutalization of the corpses dragging these American soldiers through the streets of Mogadishu, Americans were incensed, rightly so, I think. Particularly given what they knew and what they did not know. And the question that Americans posed was, why do they hate us? We went there to help them, to prevent them from dying from famine, which is all true. So there are answers to that question, actually. I don't want to divert our attention, but in the discussion we have in our makeup session, I'd be happy to entertain questions about why opinion certainly in Mogadishu turned against not just the Americans, but the intervention force more generally, Canadians and everybody else. Okay, so the point here is that Clinton took a beating when this event happened. He immediately ordered the withdrawal of American forces, and it left a very, very bad taste in the mouths of Americans, of those of the United Nations system, with respect to peacekeeping operations, peace operations, interventionism more generally. So you have to appreciate that 6 months later, when the president of Rwanda's plane is downed, and I don't buy the view that the president didn't know or couldn't have known until well into or well past the point at which much help could be offered. I just think that's been debunked by so many people. But I do think it's important to realize that everything that happened in April and on of '94 happened in the shadow of Somalia. And in particular, following the disaster of the Battle of Mogadishu, President Clinton ordered his national security staff to investigate, to research, and to come up with guidance, policy guidance, that would help presidents, not just himself, but future future administrations, make decisions about when to intervene in a peace operation, when to commit American forces to a peace operation. And peace operation is kind of a broad catch-all term that encompasses everything from classic peacekeeping, just keeping two warring parties apart, which applies to Rwanda in some sense, the RPF and the armed forces of Rwanda, the ceasefire and all that. So UNAMIR was in fact a kind of a classic peacekeeping operation in that sense, all the way up to kind of peace enforcement, where today, several years ago, the United Nations authorized the first ever offensive operation to go and hunt down a rebel faction in the DRC, in the Congo, called M23, that was responsible for just some of the worst atrocities being committed in the DRC. And the orders were to hunt down and destroy M23, and that's exactly what they did. So peace operations kind of runs the gamut, from humanitarian intervention to you name it. Presidential Decision Directive number 25 is the result of Clinton's orders, or Clinton's mission given to the National Security Council to come up with basically a rubric or a set of standards that would guide presidential decision making with respect to when to send soldiers into harm's way for humanitarian purposes or for peace operations. So PDD 25, as it's referred to, represented, and this is critically important, a much, much, much more restrictive set of guidelines for the decision to send American forces into harm's way. And I think that's a point I should make here, right? The term is often used, or the term often employed as humanitarian intervention, sending forces in to stop a mass atrocity crime, particularly if the United Nations Security Council doesn't authorize it. Whatever you call it, humanitarian intervention or an R2P, action, if it is involving military forces with a mission to end something like a genocide, we're talking about war, right? And all that entails. And I think we should never, ever, ever take our eyes off that fact. I may be somewhat on the interventionist side of things if the conditions are appropriate and the need is there. But I have to, always remind myself that I'm talking about war and sending soldiers to war. So, but it's important to realize just how restrictive PDD 25 was, and when Rwanda happens, PDD 25 almost guarantees that we will not intervene because of the guidelines that were constitutive of the National Security Council's conclusions. PDD 25 creates a vital national interest test. Now, if you think about it, if we're talking about a humanitarian intervention, the use of American forces for a humanitarian purpose, like George Herbert Walker Bush in Somalia, if we have to have a vital national interest at stake, 99.999% of all humanitarian crises that we might do something about are going to fall outside the purview of our ability to intervene, because it will not satisfy the vital national interest test. Some might, but most obviously won't, I think. So right off the bat, demanding that there be a vital national interest test just fundamentally changes the terms under which the world's hegemon will intervene for human protection purposes. So the U.S. would intervene, PDD 25 says, only with U.S. military officers in control of U.S. troops. Now, that's not actually anything new. That's always been the case. So sometimes it gets confusing for some. Somalia actually had two separate forces, two separate missions. There was a UN mission at UNISOM, and then there was a separate American force, UNITAF, and that's just kind of classic American sovereignty-loving sort of posture. We are just not going to put American soldiers under the command of foreign commanders. So that's not a new stipulation. It also calls that the U.S. government will be determining the political and military objectives to be clear and feasible. Okay, that's perhaps a lesson from some previous interventions that some might say Somalia didn't have a clear exit strategy because we weren't really clear about what we were there to accomplish other than to not have people be starving. When do we know that the job is done, sort of thing, right? So this requires that the U.S. government determines very clearly what the political and military objectives are and that they are feasible. A mission must represent the best means to advance U.S. interests. Now, here's kind of reconnection to the vital national interest test. A mission that we will submit, the United States will participate in and provide American forces for, must represent the best means to advance U.S. interests. Again, PDD 25 is so incredibly restrictive that this notion or this element of the guidelines will again exclude the overwhelming majority of human protection crises or complex humanitarian emergencies that would arise. Because simply intervening in Myanmar to save the Rohingya or Myanmar now to save the Myanmaris from their own military. It just isn't going to often be in any direct way seen as advancing U.S. interests. But if it has to, as PDD 25 calls for, then we just won't be doing much humanitarian intervening. There has to be popular domestic support for the operation. That also is not new. It is a pretty rare occasion that an American president will send forces into harm's way without the support of the American people. But however, it's usually quite simple for presidents to obtain that support. Americans are very, very quick to, quote, rally around the flag when a president makes a decision to take some sort of action on the international stage like that. So now that there's a big, kind of scholarly foreign policy literature on how long that support will stay high. But it's reasonable, I think, that not having any support for the intervention at the domestic level would be a pretty risky move. And undermine the capacity of the Americans to actually effectively pursue the humanitarian mission. And if it is not authorized by the UN Security Council under Chapter 7, which would make it illegal or unlawful by international law, PDD 25 requires that there must be a ceasefire in place and the consent of the parties to be obtained. Now that's just, if you're familiar with international law, you're familiar with peacekeeping at all, this is classic peacekeeping, okay? We have one of the most important reports studying the success and failure of peacekeeping operations, known as the Brahimi Report, kind of famously said, do not send peacekeepers where there is not a peace to keep. Classic peacekeeping is, dated to the very origins of the United Nations, where we send in forces when, parties to a conflict have gotten tired of the conflict, have come to understand that there is no way to win that conflict. An agreement is signed, and they both appreciate the presence of neutral forces as a way to help implement the peace agreement. So it's neutrality, consent of the parties. So what PDD is 25 is basically saying is that humanitarian intervention, if we're going to intervene in a human protection crisis problem, it's got to be in a kind of classic, consent of the parties. Now, how are we going to obtain the consent of the Hutus or the Nazis, for that matter, in the in the context of a complex humanitarian emergency like mass atrocity crimes. It's clearly just not going to happen. So you can kind of see what is happening here. Somalia casts such a dark shadow and leaves such a great level of fear about putting American forces into harm's way that it essentially establishes the basis for no intervention whatsoever. And but ultimately, political, economic, humanitarian consequences of inaction are considered unacceptable. Okay, so fair enough. If we're going to act, it has to be understood that not acting will lead to unacceptable humanitarian costs. Fair enough. And finally, U.S. involvement is needed for success of the intervention. So here we have PDD 25 in a nutshell, and you can see all but the last two of those bullets are intended to greatly restrict the conditions under which the United States would actually be called and choose to intervene in a human protection crisis problem. So it's critical to understand that when Rwanda breaks out, PDD 25, having been driven by the lessons, good or bad lessons, correct or incorrect lessons of Somalia, generated. Okay? And so why we choose to bystand, and again, bystanding is not passivity, as we'll see, is heavily influenced by PDD 25, which is itself the legacy of Somalia. All right, so that one. So, what about justice? Right? What do we do with the fact that we have, in the case of Rwanda, truly mass participation in mass murder? Right? All mass atrocity events, in the end, in the post-conflict, in the post-war, post-genocidal context, raise really vexing questions of justice. And so now we're going to hear a little bit about the International Criminal Tribunal that was established for Rwanda to try the principal architects of Rwanda, and then we'll hear how Rwanda dealt with the other 300,000 people accused of participation in genocide. So, you've got the fundamental question of how to prosecute 300,000 murder defendants, right? So for the first time in history, an international tribunal, the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, delivered verdicts against persons responsible for committing genocide. So the Genocide Convention passed in 1948 leads to no convictions for the crime of genocide until Rwanda, and it is the ICTR that does so. So the first convictions for persons responsible for committing genocide are delivered in the ICTR. The ICTR was also the first institution to recognize sexual violence, rape, as a means of perpetrating genocide. And you can kind of imagine how that, if we go back to the constitutive definition of genocide, creating the psychological conditions and those sorts of things, it was high time that sexual violence that's a kind of an instrument of warfare today is seen as an actus reus of the crime of crimes. So the International Criminal Tribunal indicted 93 principal architects of the Rwandan genocide. It sentenced 62 of them. 14 defendants were acquitted of their charges. Another 10 were referred back to national jurisdictions, either Belgium or Rwanda for its capacity, France. So 10 were taken out of the ICTR and back to some national jurisdiction. 3 fugitives were referred to what's called the Mechanism for International Criminal Tribunals, and that includes, in fact, my dear friend Anani Nkurunziza. 2 died before trial, and 2 indictments were withdrawn before the trial for reasons of evidence. You would think that it'd be pretty cut and dry, but particularly when it comes to crimes of rape and sexual violence, gender-based violence, evidence becomes very, very difficult to obtain, very quickly. There are criticisms of the criminal tribunal. If you think about it, it took 15 years to sentence 62 persons, but there are criticisms from all kind of perspectives, but I'm one who sort of tends to defend the tribunal, whether it's the one for Sierra Leone or Rwanda or Bosnia-Herzegovina or the International Criminal Court today. In terms of the speed with which it can carry out its work, if we want justice, real justice, not victor's justice, and we want to feel confident that the verdicts that are delivered, unlike the one I'm going to talk about at the very end here today, that's deeply, deeply saddening. If we want to have confidence that the verdicts that the justice institutions deliver are sound and based on evidence and a respect for due process, then we're just going to have to accept that these things take time. We're talking about cross-national, cross-cultural engagements, and so I'm not one who is overly critical of the time frame with which a tribunal proceeds. There are other grounds that one might level against criminal tribunals, and we could perhaps take those up also. But nevertheless, given the fact that Rwanda was a classic case of mass participation in mass murders, some 300,000 criminal defendants charged with murder in the context or other, crimes against humanity in the context of genocide. How do you prosecute? How does a state like Rwanda that has been brought to its knees and is just emerging out of the rubble of a state collapsing genocide and civil war that reignited, when it's clear, however, the alternative cannot be an international criminal tribunal, given that it takes some 15 years to prosecute or try to prosecute just under 100. Right? So what Rwanda chose was a kind of blend, and I don't want people to assume that this is like if you know anything about, say, South Africa's Truth and Reconciliation Commission, this is not that. One of the things I like about the Jakacha courts, and there are grounds for criticism, due process grounds for criticism. They clearly did not institute adequate due process protections for defendants. But one of the things I like about the Gacaca courts, in comparison to the Mandela and Desmond Tutu approach with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa, is in South Africa, it's, I think, and we could talk about this again also when we convene as a makeup session. South Africans didn't get enough justice. Black South Africans did not get enough justice, having endured many decades of a brutally violent apartheid state. And given what I'm going to say at the very end, unexpectedly, Nelson Mandela is, I don't have many heroes left. And Nelson Mandela is right up there. And I've kind of talked about him in many of my classes that, if, perhaps even in this one, I'm not sure, I compare him to me, right? If you send me to prison for 27 years for the crime of trying to liberate my people from an apartheid system, and then take me out of prison and put me in the presidential palace. In other words, take me from prison and give me the levers of state power. I'm going to get some payback. I wish I weren't wired that way, but I just know who I am. Nelson Mandela just wasn't in any way wired that way. But I have come to be somewhat critical of Mandela's vision for post-apartheid South Africa. I have come to believe that in some ways he was such an extraordinarily forgiving person that he failed to appreciate that he was trying to lead a nation of suffering victims to a place that most people just couldn't be expected to get to. And they did not get enough of what they needed, and that's justice, retributive justice. So the Gacaca courts, as we'll see, is capable of handing down very serious punishment, including life imprisonment. My friend Anani Nkurunziza, were he ever to get caught, or had he been caught up in this period, he would have likely been taken before a Gacaca court, perhaps at the Tribunal, I'm not sure. But the reason I think likely a Gacaca court is the woman who was at radio television, Liebe de Milcolin, who was even more popular than Anani. She was the second most popular in terms of airtime at RTLM. She was tried at a Gacaca court and given a life sentence. So this is not just all about, kind of forgiveness by any stretch. So let's hear what this is about. So, okay, that takes us through some of the kind of key dynamics and events and institutions of the conflict. We'll take up questions about this and tangential to this as you wish in our makeup mini session. But I'm unfortunately have to kind of offer a postscript that is just just become news late last night, early this morning. I toyed with kind of how to introduce this or even mention this, but I'm going to start with something I've written quite recently, and that is that a thing, it is often said, can be two things. And this is true of the vanquisher of Hutu power, the head of the victorious Rwandan Patriotic Front. Paul Kagame is the vanquisher of Hutu power and the one who ended the genocide. He is also the person who has presided over staggering levels of economic growth and development in the post-genocide era. He is also an unquestionably murderous tyrant and war criminal. And we can talk about the war crimes that he has committed both inside, during the civil war that he launched in 1990, and after in the Congo, and presently today. The Congo remains the most deadly conflict since World War II, the world's most deadly conflict since World War II. And it is largely because Kagame keeps his armed forces in the Congo, raping it of conflict minerals, which has fueled the economic success story that is Rwanda. He is all these things. He is the hero that ended the genocide of the Tutsi people. He has presided over a simply staggering China level of economic success. He is also an increasingly murderous tyrant who murders his political opponents no matter how close they may have been. And he is an absolute, unquestioned war criminal that needs to be brought to justice, but will never be because he's still a darling of the West for his interventionism that drives the worst conflict in the world since World War II in neighboring Congo. A thing can be more than two things. Paul Kagame is at least three. And he has just orchestrated, or finished orchestrating, a total bullshit kangaroo trial court that yesterday, early this morning, delivered a guilty verdict of terrorism charges and a 25-year, which means death, sentence against the one true shining light among Hutus during the genocide, Mr. Paul Rusesabagina. the star of the movie, the central character of the movie, Hotel Rwanda. If you've ever seen it, if you haven't, you need to. I don't have many heroes. I may have perhaps one remaining unadulterated hero, and that's him. When he came to my former university to speak, he had a 15-minute standing ovation before he said a single word. He hasn't even been introduced yet. This is Bob Bottoms, someone I'm consulting with now. He is, in fact, a hero. And he has, because he became involved in politics, because he, like so many others, have become deeply troubled by the tyrant that Paul Kagame has become. Paul Kagame didn't murder him like he has others. Former colleagues but turned political opponents have wound up murdered in South African hotels, and he doesn't even bother denying it. When his former Minister of Interior, I think, who became openly critical of Kagame's authoritarianism, was found murdered in a South African hotel, and Kagame was asked about it, he didn't say no. He didn't say he didn't have anything to do with it. He said simply, hey, if you lie down with dogs, you get up with fleas. He is the vanquisher of Hutu power, the ender of the genocide, the presider over remarkable economic success, as well as a murderous tyrant and a war criminal, and he is now sentenced, Paul Rusesabagina, to 25 years in prison on trumped-up terrorism charges simply because Paul Rusesabagina dared to get involved in a political party. That's our story.